I'm Dr. Scott Smith. I am professor of ethics and Christian apologetics in the Biola University MA in Christian Apologetics program, which is part of Talbot School of Theology. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about critical race theory and kind of how I got interested in all this sort of thing. And it actually started for me in an unexpected way. When I was a PhD student at the University of Southern California from 95 to 2000, I was in the PhD program in religion and social ethics. And also what I did to get my stipend paid, I taught their freshman writing program. So there I was exposed to not only some of my own fellow grad students, but also those from English, linguistics, a number of other kinds of programs too. And it was interesting because I had cut my teeth here when I was at Talbot before I went on in the MA philosophy program. I cut my teeth getting some of the feel of postmodern thought. And when I went to USC, when I was hearing all these different sorts of things being talked about frequently, it was like, okay, I kind of put it in that framework of thought that this is all about postmodernism in some way. But I kept hearing talks from my fellow grad students about things like power moves, Nietzsche, Foucault. These were heroes, for them. These were people I hadn't really had to study, before. And their ideas about this is, ethics all reduces down to power was like, what's going on here? This is more than just postmodernism, it seemed. But I couldn't put my finger on it. And as I was teaching, with my fellow students or grad students in the freshman writing program, the topics that they kept coming up with, I noticed, were about race, class, and gender. So like, okay, what is going on here behind all this? And as I kept listening and hearing different people talk, I heard a lot of emphases on more radical feminism, brought in, but also about oppression and Marx and this and that. And it was like, what's going on? Well, that was going on. That planted some seeds for me. Fast forward, I was becoming a little more familiar with this because I have a daughter who is going through an international baccalaureate program in a high school local, to us. And she would come home talking about these sorts of things. It's like, I've heard about these before. So what was going on here? And I still couldn't put my finger on all the different things. But it was interesting that as I did, as I kept listening to her, and I started looking at things more, an opportunity came up to have a chance to meet with several faculty who were wanting to talk about what these things were that were going on in Christian higher education. And so I'm in the habit of asking the Lord often, it's like before I go to some things like this, is there anything in particular you want me to see from, this meeting? And I felt he was clearly telling me, pay attention to the third speaker. Because when you do, what you're going to find that this person's talking about is going to fit all these different pieces you've been working on in your academic, kinds of research. Whether it's in ethics, postmodern thought, problems with having knowledge based on naturalism, and all these other things. So I went to that meeting, and I was like, I don't know who the third person was going to be. But when this person spoke, I listened very carefully. And it was about these very things that I had heard about when I was at USC, and the things my daughter was coming home with, and the things I could see in the newspapers. And it was called critical theory. Finally, I had a name to really put to this. And then as I dug into it more, I saw that critical race theory is one that spawned off of critical theory. And so this became a very strong interest, of mine, because I was seeing it play out of its influence in Christian higher ed, but not just there, but in education generally, high school or lower, college, whatever, secular or Christian. And so I started to see implications and some of those connections that I think the Lord wanted me to, start paying attention to. And the result was I became very interested. So what I want to talk about today is the fruit of some of that kind of work. And it's to give you an idea or an overview of how to understand and respond to critical race theory. It's not going to be just about critical race theory, though. We're also going to look at critical theory, somewhat along the way. So here we go. First of all, I want to point out that this kind of view is a continuation of several others that have been going on for quite some time. It wasn't like all of a sudden in the 1960s, people started thinking along these sort of lines. These sort of ideas have a long history if we look back, even some centuries worth. But the first one is the idea that there are no essences, no essential natures. An example of an essence might be, as far as for living things, for us, for human beings, it's our essential nature would be our soul. And as Christians, we know that that is made in God's image. It's what defines us as the kind of thing we are. We are a human because we have a human soul made in God's image. We don't have a dog's essence, if you will, or a cat's essence, or anything like that, fortunately. The other thing is an idea is that everything is particular. Or, to put it this way, everything is what it is in name only. This is what the word nominalism means. Now, on this sort of view, there are no universal qualities that all different things can share and have in common. For example, I have a human soul. Each of you, who are listening to this, also have a human soul. That is something that is called a universal. It's one kind of thing, and yet can have many different instances. But on this kind of view, in contrast, there is no such thing we literally share in common like that. To say that we all have a soul in common is just to use the word soul for that sort of thing. There isn't such a thing we really share. The other kind of view that is a continuation here is what's called standpoint epistemology. And on this kind of view, it's that we always know or have knowledge from our particular different standpoints. A standpoint as a Christian, perhaps, or maybe more specifically, a Christian who has grown up in the United States in this and that, sort of time, or someone who is an atheist, maybe from, such and such time period and location, and etc. We always know things from our particular standpoint, and no one can have any knowledge of any universal truths. There are none, really, on this view, when you take the nominalist view seriously. So here's a little bit more about that, about standpoint epistemology and a view called historicism. Big words, but hang with me, it'll be fine. On this kind of idea, all knowledge is situated. That is, it's socially based and embedded in a particular historical location and can't be abstracted from that as though we can get some universal truth by abstracting, from some given context. No, what we know is always tied to these different specific locations. Our situatedness, if you will, the way we've been shaped by numbers of different things, they shape how we interpret reality, so much so that we cannot access the way things really are apart from our interpretive grid, if you will. So we cannot know any sort of universal truths, if there were any, for all people in all times, because that would require a universal standpoint. And none of us can ever achieve that. It's denied by the theory. Now, some might say, well, God has, that, kind of vantage point. As Christians, they might come back and say that. Yes, but the problem is we can't ever have a God's eye view, according to this kind of view. So everything ends up being our interpretation drawn from our particular location in time and history and place. Now, here's some key secular influences, people who have helped really shape these kinds of views. The first one, Antonio Gramsci, an Italian who helped adapt Karl Marx's views from economics into a more cultural kind of framework. The other three are all people who are part of what was called the Frankfurt School, which is where critical theory the general umbrella kind of view, was birthed. Max Horkheimer, is one key player. Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, is another here. All of them are Marxist-inspired, but let me give a caution, in saying that. One thing I found as I speak, in churches, about this sort of topic, and as I listen, maybe even to other Christians, they kind of look for this idea that if critical theory can be somehow labeled Marxist, they've somehow been able to marginalize it and therefore have nothing more to do with it. It's like, oh, that's from Marx. And I think what they tend to be thinking is here, this relives the old Soviet-style Marxism, when really there are some interesting differences. It's applying Marx's ideas not, yes, to economic, there are implications there, but more to culture. And that's where it gets people who embrace these ideas see a real difference. So here's some key points, about critical theory generally, and we'll look at critical race theory a little more specifically soon. But a critical theory is one that seeks to liberate us from domination and oppression and increase freedom in all its different kinds of forms. And on this view, and this is like Marx thought, there are two fundamental groups in opposition to each other. There are the oppressed, the minority, groups, however that's cashed out, whether that's by class or race, gender, whatever. There are the oppressed group or groups, and then there are the oppressor or dominant, kind of group. On this kind of view, our fundamental ethical duty then is to liberate the oppressed from their oppression by the dominant oppressor group by leveling power and redistributing resources, which are material, kind of tangible kinds of ones. Because on this kind of view, that's the nature of what's real. It's really a materialist kind of view. What's real ultimately is matter. And so this leads to the idea of having equal outcomes, but not necessarily an equality of opportunity then. Now here's some more assumptions. On critical theory, and especially as Marcuse developed it, we are to be free to live as we want. And for Marcuse, that really involved being sexually free, to define my own sexuality and be free from all restraints that society might put on us, there. Another point is that institutions of traditional Western societies oppress and alienate us from our true selves. And that is something that is found by looking inwardly into ourselves. Psychologically, who is the real me? And that is my self-concept. It's something I get to define for myself based upon my own individual take, on the real me. There's no essence that defines me, and society can oppress me by, imposing certain definitions on me. So in this kind of view, we are to be freed from those sort of things to be able to define ourselves, our true selves. And so that is to get rid of problems of disrespect, disapproval, and social inequalities, according to this view. Again, equality here is not really out of opportunity, but it's of results, of outcomes. How do you liberate? For the secular critical theorists, a key way for this is going to be using the state's coercive power to tear down the oppressor group's privileges and hegemony. Now let me bring in three people who are often talked about in my program at USC as I listen to different students. And I think it's Paul Ricoeur who called these people the masters of suspicion. With these kind of views brought in by, for example, Friedrich Nietzsche, we used to think morals were these universal truths, for all people. But actually, what he has tried to do is expose them for being just power moves, expressions of power, really the will to dominate, others. Marx is another one of these masters of suspicion. For him, it's, more or less, it's the structures of society serve to protect the interests of the majority or dominant group and oppress the minority ones. So when you look at what's the explanation of historical events for him, it's due to differences between classes. This is what he called historical materialism. It's not a matter of individual conscious motives or choices. Freud comes along and he adds a key element in all this. The true self is intrinsically sexual here. Sexuality is key to our identity, and that is something Marcuse will pick up on shortly thereafter. But for Freud, we used to think that our behavior was basically due to our conscious thoughts, and choices. But really, it's the unconscious is really why we believe, as we do, especially due to our fathers and sexuality. Now, critical race theory picks up on this sort of attitude of suspicion. And when we claim about having universal rights, true for all people and applying to everyone, and of equality for all people, and of dignity, for all people, so often these have been, viewed as being nothing but just words and empty promises. And by focusing on abstract universal principles, it's tended to blind us to the sufferings of particular individuals, who've been marginalized. There's more suspicion going on with critical race theory, and that is of liberalism itself. Now by that, I don't mean, are you going to have the political parties, one on the left and one more on the right, and the left is called the liberal and the right are more conservative. That's not the idea here. Here, liberalism is the political system itself, the form of government, in the United States at least, that focuses on primarily the good of the individual as the subject of universal rights. But as critical race theorists, or crits they'll call themselves, point out, so often we'll focus then on having fair procedures, but these can end up being undermined, in actual practice. There's also a suspicion of meritocracy. For crits, this is just a myth that we can all improve ourselves by our hard work and achievement, that we can pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. For them, they see this as just a myth perpetuated, by our liberal kind of society. Now, here's a lengthy quote, but I think it's worth going over, in a little detail. So let me just try to read it to you. This is from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, right off a website, from one of their schools. So what is critical race theory? Here's how they say. CRT recognizes that racism is ingrained in the fabric and system of American society. The individual racist need not exist to note that institutional racism is pervasive in the dominant culture. So notice the stress. It's on institutional racism rather than being, whether or not somebody's an individual racist. This is the analytical lens that CRT uses in examining existing power structures. CRT identifies that these power structures are based on white privilege and white supremacy, which perpetuates the marginalization of people of color. CRT also rejects the traditions, as I just mentioned, of liberalism and meritocracy. And here's a little more. Again, you can see on the screen, this is from UCLA's School of Public Affairs, and they have the name of the page is, What is Critical Race Theory? Now, applied in law, legal discourse says that the law is neutral and colorblind. However, CRT challenges this legal truth, if you will, by examining liberalism and meritocracy as vehicles for self-interest, power, and privilege. CRT also recognizes that liberalism and meritocracy are often stories heard from those with wealth and power and privilege. So these stories paint a false picture of meritocracy, they claim. Everyone who works hard can attain wealth, power, and privilege while ignoring the systemic inequalities that institutional racism provides. Okay, so there's a mouthful there. We'll, continue to, highlight some of those things, but notice the focus on institutional racism, the idea that it's endemic, in our institutions, in society, whether or not individuals are racist. And it's this kind of racism in the systems that needs to be dismantled in order to achieve a just society. Now, CRT has quite a legacy in its development in law. And I think part of this idea has been a long time coming. When I was an undergrad a long time ago in political science, I remember studying Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he was held up as one of these kind of luminaries, if you will, of the Supreme Court. But looking back now, here is an interesting idea of him long before we saw the critical theorists come on the scene. So here's his idea, and here's what he says. Law is really all about power, not morality. He says this: a law should be called good if it reflects the will of the dominant forces of the community, even if it will take us to hell. That's quite a statement. It's really just law is a reflection of the power, of the powerful. It's a matter of power, not of a moral basis, behind it. And that's what law is, on his view. Well, this fits in with things like Michel Foucault has been saying. Someone, again, who has highlighted a lot, my time at USC. He says, or here's an idea from him, power is transmitted, normalized, and internalized through social institutions, socializing people into compliance with norms that serve who? The controlling group's interests. You may note from the slide there that this is taken from a book by Özlem Sensoy and Robin DiAngelo. This book is called Is Everyone Really Equal?, which gives a great overview of lots of these ideas, if you want to dig a little further. There's also roots in critical race theory from radical feminism. It provided insights into how power relates to the construction of social roles, as well as the largely unnoticed patterns and habits that contribute to forms of domination. In particular, what the radical feminists brought to light here was through the lens of patriarchy. Well, that kind of idea has really caught on, and that appeal to power, is one very much embraced with critical race theory too. There's also an element from some of the postmoderns here, Jacques Derrida in particular, and his idea of what's called deconstructionism. Derrida has a very interesting idea, and it fits with some of those key points I mentioned at the very beginning. There are no essences or essential natures to anything. And if there were, they would define something as the kind of thing it is. So there are no universal moral truths that would have an essence, to them. And everything ends up being our interpretation. So there's no objective meaning in any text, like Derrida would say. We then bring the meaning to the text. It results in a death of the author, kind of view. So-called universal truths are really nothing but power moves. We're deconstructing the ostensive meaning, that somebody ostensibly meant when they said something, and really looking for the hidden power move, behind it, here. Now, here are a few examples of people who embrace critical race theory. Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic, they have written a very important book in the field. It's called An Introduction to Critical Race Theory. It's been in at least 3 editions. They bring in the ties to legal theory, as well. Robin DiAngelo, I mentioned her a moment ago. You may also happen to know of her book, White Fragility, more widely known, than the other one I mentioned. Ibram Kendi, a key book of his, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Now, he and DiAngelo may not identify as crits. They may prefer being called anti-racists, but I think, nonetheless, if you look at the two, the ideas are very close, on that. So I'm including them here, for my purposes, at least as part of, as examples of crits. So let's look at some more of the main points of critical race theory here. And these will, some of these I think will remind you of that long quote or definition, from the UCLA website. The first one is that racism is common. And it's not just limited to individuals. It's systemic, and especially that. That's the focus of CRT. There's also racial disparity. There are differences in outcomes or results. Maybe it's in terms of health-related outcomes for different racial groups, or economic, outcomes for different racial groups. There's also this idea of interest convergence. The idea here in critical race theory is that only if the material interests of the dominant group, the white majority here, would align with those of minority groups, only then would the white majority be willing to really work with and cooperate then, with the minority ones. Another point's this: races are social constructions. So they're not fixed, and they're not rooted in biology. Instead, we all share in what Kendi says is a common humanity. And he's right, we do. But something we'll think about here with that is that there's no essence to our humanity. So what is this common humanity? So roles and expectations are things that we construct, on this kind of view. Here are a couple more things. One is this term you've probably heard called intersectionality. We all have many sources for our different identities, our self-concepts, as I call them, and these can overlap in all sorts of different interlocking ways to oppress different people. So, for example, somebody could be not only black, but poor, and also a lesbian. And in that sense, a member of three oppressed, minority-type groups. So they have a triple dose, you might say, of oppression, through those different means. Hegemony is another point here, another main idea of CRT. And as Delgado and Stefancic say, it's domination by the ruling class and unconscious acceptance of that state of affairs by the subordinate group. So what they're trying to do, what crits are trying to do, is help bring these things to light and bring people to awareness so that things can be changed and perhaps even bring a revolution, in these systems. Now, let me pause for a minute and just especially give an ethical focus to this. There's some things here, if you start reading their literature, you'll notice something come through very clearly that they presuppose, morally speaking. One is the equality of all human beings. This is something that's just loud and clear, in their writings. And they're right about this. I would, sure say on that, because you're all made in God's image. I would say, from a Christian standpoint. But from the CRT standpoint, they're presupposing this. So the equality of all humans. Another one is the dignity of all humans. So equality and dignity of everyone. So far it sounds, it's tracking pretty well here, in alignment, with some Christian ideas. Justice should be done for all humans too. So here's another good presupposition. Oppression of humans is wrong and should be relieved. Now, oppression here undefined in that sense, but still a good general principle, it seems. Notice the last one. On CRT in particular, we should be free, that is, autonomous to become our true selves. That is, when you think of autonomous in this way, it's the combination of two Greek words, auto, nomos. Auto, self, nomos, legislating. We are self-legislating. We're going to legislate for ourselves who's the real me and what is really moral and all those things. And that's going to be according to our own identities or self-concepts and not those imposed upon us by the dominant group. Okay, now I've given quite an overview of lots of things here, but let me start to move into some assessment here. Let me just say this, first of all. What I've found from experience, at least, even if a view is largely, going to be unbiblical and land in very unbiblical positions, usually, though, if an idea is gaining traction, with people in society, whether it's with Christians or non-Christians, usually it's onto something. It's not totally in left field, 100%. They're tapping into something. And I think CRT is doing that. It's tapping into some things here. So there's some strengths here I think we can acknowledge, about critical race theory. Well, let me suggest a few. First of all, I think descriptively, and note my emphasis there, descriptively, I think it's potentially powerful, potentially useful as an analytical tool. That is, what it does is it causes us, or it draws attention to systems or institutions, and it asks us, are there racist practices, involved here? And one of the things that's interesting, I think, is to read different crits literature, and you'll see that they've tried to do a lot of work to surface lots of examples. One of them is redlining in real estate. Those kind of practices, that were designed to keep different minorities from buying into certain areas in order to keep that, basically a white, majority, area. I've heard of stories, of this that have happened, to real people. That kind of practice, was something embedded in a system. And so that kind of example, that crits can point to, and maybe others too, are helpful, I think. So descriptively, it's helpful in that it draws our attention to say, is there racism going on here in the practices of some institution or group? And if there are, then let's address them. But notice I'm not saying that we should go in presupposing that there are. That's where I think it goes too far. I descriptively think it can be a strength because at least it draws our attention to say, is this going on here? And if so, great, let's see if it is and do something about it. Another thing is that a strength, I think, is that race is not some innate physical quality due to genetic differences. We're all human beings, all made in God's image. All humans are also members of the same species, Homo sapiens, and they're all persons regardless of phenotype. Another thing is by focusing on particular kinds of oppression, by particular that particular people's face, I think it can help us become aware of those problems so that we can then address them. Otherwise, it's easy, I think, to gloss over and overlook those sort of things. By focusing on generalized problems. And Rabbi Irving Greenberg is somebody who wrote about this happening back in World War II, just to give an illustration of how this kind of thing can happen. His point was that with the Holocaust, he said, look, the West, especially the United States, knew well ahead of their entry into the war that they knew about the atrocities happening to the Jews at the hands of the Nazis. And yet, he says, that the U.S.'s entry into the war was delayed because they were so focusing on universal rights for all people rather than the particular sufferings of Jewish people at the hands of the Nazis. So the idea we can focus on these universal truths, sometimes that can serve to keep us unaware or not focus on the plights of specific people or people groups. A couple other things. CRT also calls us to pay attention to the perspectives of people of other groups. And when we do that, we can begin to notice how our own perspectives are shaped and influenced by all our different shaping factors, our situatedness, if you will. When I taught a class on social justice and apologetics before, one of the best things for me, again, I think that, I probably learned the most out of anybody in that class. But one of the best things for me was I got to listen to the stories of lots of other people in there from lots of different backgrounds. And it was so helpful because I have my own shaping influences that have, that I cannot then, say, well, I know what it's like, to be racially profiled, by police, let's say. But others, in the group could, perhaps speak, to that kind of thing. And by listening with empathy to people's stories, it's like, oh, I could begin to empathize and enter into and begin to understand their perspectives, on things. One more thing. I think CRT also has a strength in that it stresses the importance of doing justice in this life, not just for the by and by, in heaven, because God wants that, and it specifically puts our attention on that, and that's just a good thing. Now, I want to do something here and compare the biblical basis for these morals with the ones that CRT has as its basis for those morals. So here's the first one. Biblically, why do morals like we should treat people with dignity and justice and equality and these sort of things, why do these apply to us? Because we're made in God's image. We have as our essential nature our soul, our human soul. God's image, it's because of who God is that these moral qualities and principles apply to us, that they're normative for us. And these principles and virtues or qualities are universally applicable for all human beings, not just some, or here or there. Moreover, based on the scriptural grounding, these morals are objectively real. They're valid and they are real whether or not any human happens to believe them or not. They are still normative and apply to us. And how can we know them? Well, in part, by our using our reason. I think we see the crits, doing that. They're using their reason as image bearers to realize we should treat people justly. But we also have it by special revelation, given there we should treat people with dignity, with justice. People shouldn't be oppressed, so on. So we can know, what is objectively the case, as God has revealed these, those different ways. But on CRT, what kind of thing are we and what kind of thing are these morals? There are no essential natures. And we, basically, are material beings in a material world. It's physical, if you will. And so there's nothing then, there's no essence to define us as the kind of thing we are, or these morals as the kind of thing they are, or why they're normative, for us. There's no intrinsic connection, you might say, between these things and ourselves. That leads us somewhere. Morals then on CRT, though the crits are realizing some good ones here, actually these moral qualities and principles are just our constructs. What we have come up with, what we have devised according to our interpretations. They can't be what is objectively real, and transcendent, of us. Another thing is that morals are all particulars, again, because they are in name only. They reject the idea that there could be any universal morals that apply to everyone. So there are no morals on their kind of view that are true for all people in all times and places, and that are not our constructs, but are objectively real. How do we know them on this view? Always from our particular situated standpoints. No one has a direct gaze into reality to know how things really are in themselves. That means everything is our interpretation. So we can then ask, well, these morals then are these crits' interpretations. But what if others don't agree with them? What if somebody comes along and says, no, everyone isn't really equal? And lots of people down through time have argued that way and have put many people to death, for that kind of reason. So in other words, if these things are just interpretations, and they're really just power moves, that's what's at work here then too. An assertion of power to try to gain power and, trade places maybe with the oppressor group, so that the oppressed now are the powerful and the oppressors now become the oppressed, because there are only two places to stay at, on the view. Now, a little bit more. If there are no essences, then let's look at these morals. There's no essence to justice. So we might ask, well, whose justice? Whose equality? Which dignity are we talking about here? These are up to us to define as we see best. But that's going to only perpetuate what crits are against: hegemonic power. So equality, is not a moral equality, because there's no essence to this. It's just defined in terms of equity, equal outcomes, equal material results. And if morals are just power moves, then how is it that we can be moral by imposing our own morals, onto others, which is what it has to be, on this kind of view? Here's another, issue with if there are no essences. There's no basis for treating all people as intrinsically valuable, which I think critics, presuppose, are quite arguably, from what they're saying, intrinsically or essentially valuable. But there's no basis for it, because there are no essences. Now, if that's the case, that sets it up for one people can be preferred over a different people group. And it's a setup for more oppression of further kind. Let's think a little bit more about justice, equality, and freedom. Critics seem to define justice as equality, or better, as equity, or equality of outcomes. But if so, then it seems to mean that our freedoms have to be curtailed, and maybe severely, in order to keep the equality of results. Because there are many respects in which we are not equal. In comparison with J.P. Moreland here, for example, he is a very quick thinker and has all sorts of breadth of background and ability of thinking of things. For me, I'm different. I have to think about things carefully, chew on them for a while. And then it's like, okay, now I see these things and see implications of them. But he's quick, with that. I'm not equal to him, in that way. People are not equal physically, in all sorts of ways. They're not equal in other sorts of ways as well. But justice seems to constrain equality, lest equality would undermine freedom. But justice also needs to constrain freedom from eliminating any equality. Otherwise, it would be everybody is doing whatever, they're to be their true selves. In other words, we can't be utterly free to do whatever we want. These three have to be held together: justice, equality, and freedom. Here's another point for assessment. I think CRT collapses justice into equality. And then, so if that's the case, I think CRT cannot deliver on equal outcomes anyway, because that's in tension with the freedom to define our true selves. Because let's say somebody says, well, to be my true self as Someone like Dax Coward, you can look up his name on the internet. Coward is Cohart. There are all sorts of stories about him involving his fight for his right to commit assisted suicide. And he wasn't allowed to do that, but he fought for that. The story of him goes, what we could say, he felt like made him a worthwhile person, or his true self, was that he was a ladies' man, a womanizer, and he could go dancing and all these sorts of things. He was in a terrible accident. He was burned horribly all over his body, so he was in terrible pain, but didn't die. Had all sorts of reconstructive surgeries and still never looked exactly like he did before the fire. What Dax argues is that here was my true self, my identity, if you will, and having lost that identity, I now should be permitted to take my own life. Well, there's the true self for Dax Coward. But let's say, like for myself, I wanted to become a professor, Lord willing. So I required going through all sorts of years of graduate school, sacrifice and whatnot for that, lots of money, to do that. That required different kinds of resources and different amounts of resources than Dax Coward's true self would have. In other words, there's not going to be this numeric equality of outcomes here, even on this view. There's got to be some sort of restraint and constraint put on by some sort of power here over everybody, I guess the state, that's going to constrain what kind of resources will actually be given, and therefore maybe even what will be appropriate to count as a true self. What are the appropriate kind of identities we can take on and what aren't? Because it won't be that just anything goes. We're seeing that even today. If somebody wanted for some reason to say, my true self is to be a white supremacist, that is not going to go over in society. They are not going to be given the resources then, on this kind of view, to live out that identity. So the view here has built-in limitations. They're going to not be able to deliver on what it promises. Here's another assessment point. If everything is really particular or in name only, well, what might happen? We think we know what we're talking about when we use terms like justice, but whose justice are we talking about here? Morals end up being just what they are in name only, due to how some person or some group uses words. But as the expression goes, talk is cheap. We can talk good talk, but so what? On this kind of view, there's no universal moral quality of justice or equality or dignity. It's just what a particular group has defined, as such for them. But if so, why should that definition be applied to everyone, given this kind of presupposition of the view? A little bit more if everything's particular. It seems that ethical relativism would be the result. And Kendi, if you look at his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he talks about how cultural differences are just that. They are cultural, that is, descriptive, factual differences. But he also goes on, to point out some other things that have me a little concerned. Why would it then be wrong to treat minorities differently than majority group members? After all, if a given group could have accepted such a principle as right for them, that would make it right for them on ethical relativism. And yes, we do in fact differ in many different ways. But would he agree, for example, that a white supremacist group is just descriptively different, than an anti-racist group? Surely not. Another issue. If everything is known from our particular standpoints, what happens? Well, we can acknowledge, first of all, that we are shaped by all sorts of different factors. Family upbringing, like in my case, or our location, historically, my being born in the late 1950s and growing up in California my whole life, the culture we're raised in, the geographic location, upbringing, all sorts of things. They do shape what we pay attention to. But if the theory is right, how do we know anything? Because everything, as I said, becomes interpretation. Well, if that's the case, everything becomes an interpretation, then you might ask, what am I interpreting? Well, it can't be something out there in reality because I can't access reality as it is itself. So I guess I'm interpreting my interpretation. But now I'm just interpreting that interpretation. And now I'm interpreting that interpretation, and so on, such that it's like I can't even get started in making interpretations because I've got an infinite regress of interpretations between me and reality, and I can't begin to even get started doing that. So it undermines their key claims that there are actual racist practices at work in institutions, and we know this to be the case. Because for them to be able to do that means they've got to be able to access how things are really going on here, and we can check it out and see if they're right. But on the theory, they can't make good on that. And here's another thing. I think, and this is what I'm thinking a lot more about lately. For critical race theory, and more critical theory generally, I think, it treats evil or sin as something that is systemic, but not as something that's in each individual person's heart. And that fits with Karl Marx's ideas and Jean-Jacques Rousseau's as well, that we are corrupted by society and institutions, but we ourselves are not corrupted. We don't come into the world corrupted, with inherent corruption from the fall. But if we are not corrupted, how did the institutions get corrupted? That's the part I don't get, on this view. Yet, we also know that institutions, being part of them and systems can, rub off on us and corrupt us, in different ways, so we can start taking on the practices of others, in them. So I think Christians who are drawn heavily and really influenced by critical race theory can focus and can end up focusing on changing systems in society, but start to lose the focus. And to the degree they accept critical race theory, they can lose the focus on the need to have each individual heart, a person's heart changed by being born again, in Christ. So what are some lessons from all this? Well, here are a few. Again, to kind of sum it up, I think critical race theory can be useful as a descriptive tool to draw attention and see if there are actual racist practices going on in different systems. But I think it also seems unable to ground and support its many normative ethical claims, and that's crucial. But even with those problems, and those are severe, that doesn't undermine, some of the strengths, I mentioned before. So I think we got to be careful. Guard against making either or extreme, kinds of, conclusions. It's either totally embrace it or totally reject it. I think we have to look at to what extent different views are biblically faithful, to what extent they're problematic, and then gauge that carefully. And I've been trying to do that here to say in some ways, critical race theory and critical theory are useful, but on several other ways, they have severe problems, that we really need to avoid. Here's another point. I think a helpful thing is to try to walk a mile in another person's shoes, whether it's a Christian or a non-Christian. Try to understand how and why they see things as they do. Listen to their stories, their examples. Also ask the Holy Spirit to help us empathize with people. I think, that it'll be astonishing, I think, at times where the Spirit can just speak into us as we're listening to someone and help us realize there's something really deep going on in them, and the Spirit could put, His finger on that. And then we can then in turn help address that lovingly and sensitively, with that person. It also helps us know how to pray for them. And I think that this, if we try to understand critical race theory and critical theory more generally, it can help believers and others who are inclined toward accepting critical race theory to see its strengths, but also its many weaknesses. Last set of suggestions. I think it'd be helpful to talk about this topic in age-appropriate ways. I don't have any hard and fast ideas on that, but I do think that it ought to be taught at least at high school levels, in the sense that students are going to be exposed to this thing. They're going to get it, from social media, a number of different places. And if they aren't exposed to the ideas from Christians who can help them think it through carefully, then they are going to be left on their own and what they're hearing, in their schools, to think this through for themselves. And then we're going to have a whole lot of work we're going to have to do as Christians to help them think biblically about this. It would be extremely important, then, I think, for several Christians to become up to speed on this topic so that we can teach about these things intelligently and sensitively, with others in Christian schools. I'm not sure, perhaps junior high, as well. What about in our churches? Well, if the church is silent about this matter, then I'm afraid that that's going to convey that the church, maybe has nothing to say about it. And that's dangerous. And also, part of the criticisms today is that Christianity, as part of the overall set of Western ideas, has been complicit with racism. So we need to speak into this, with other believers. And also, I think we can help people see that critical race theory does not provide the solution to the core human need, our sinfulness. It identifies some ways that there is immorality and thus sin at work in society, but it misidentifies the solution. So it cannot meet our deepest needs. The gospel of Christ, though, really can. Thanks very much.
Biola University prepares Christians to think biblically about everything, from science to business to education and the arts. Learn more at biola.edu.